Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. A new report by IMAN Research offers some rare insight into the aspirations and anxieties of Malay youth. The report is titled Orang Kita, Malay Youth Democratic Renewal Post-GE15, The Politics of Acknowledgement and Resentment. And it tells a story of a generation that is beginning to feel disillusioned and overlooked. Now, the question we want to ask tonight is how can we truly listen to the voices of young Malays before we risk their disillusionment becoming entrenched? Joining me on the show is Research Associate at IMAN Research, Aziff Azuddin, who is also the lead for the report. Aziff, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Thank you.
There's a lot to talk about this with this the study that you did. I understand it's culmination of a 2-year-long effort on your part. But talk to me about why it began. What prompted this study to focus specifically on Malay youth, and who did you talk to? Where were they? Are they representative of a voice of an entire nation?
Yeah. So we started out this report because, one, we noticed that after the 2022 general elections, there was a huge swath of support for Perikatan Nasional, specifically coming from the Malay youth voting bloc. So if you see Bridget Welsh's study that I think she published quite quickly after the elections, we saw that the number was 37% of youths voted for Perikatan Nasional. And a lot of political responses to that essentially was that, oh, this was a green wave, the youth wanted Islamicization, which I think in another show that we did like last year, 2 years ago, I think we kind of addressed that, right? So it wasn't, we wanted to approach it from, this isn't necessarily ideological, which is not necessarily true, but what are the other factors that drove youth to vote for Perikatan Nasional? Were there material factors? Was it in the sense where, was there a question of economic reality? Was there a question of like how they were, what were the environments that were shaping their views?
Okay.
So our methodology for the study essentially was that we wanted to basically go into the what is known as the Malay heartlands, basically where PAS and UMNO have historically battled it out. And in the recent elections, state and federal otherwise, we saw a lot of states flip over to Perikatan Nasional state rule, right? So these are kind of like the states where we spend most of the time with. We interviewed a lot of young Malay youths, and this ranged across the different backgrounds. You had youths who were, you know, in their spare time, they were artists, they were white-collar workers, they were entrepreneurs, they were gig workers, they were youth activists. So basically, we wanted to get kind of like a large, from a qualitative perspective, 100+ voices, which is a large sample for a qualitative study, to kind of get like an thematic idea of like what are the material realities, or what are kind of like also the political, psychological factors that made them choose Perikatan Nasional. And that's basically where the study was.
So it started out as kind of understanding how Malay youth are voting. But what I really liked about this report and your work in general, Aziff, is there is so much nuance to it. So it's gone beyond just understanding what drives a political choice. It's understanding what drives anxieties and what drives hopefulness amongst, aspirations amongst Malay youth. So I want to delve into that. I want to explore more about the nuance of that. So there were some news headlines following your report that had, you know, Malay youth and made, I think, glaring what kind of one-line headlines. But in your explanation of the nuance of the findings of your survey, how would you like us to understand the use of the phrase acknowledgement and resentment as you're using it in the report?
Yeah, so when we talk about acknowledgement, I think we want to look at Undi 18 and how Undi 18, when it was tabled and built and now made part of law, and I think it was done in 2019, if not mistaken. So that you can say was one of Malaysia's attempts to renew democracy, right? To kind of introduce youths into the voting ballots.
Yeah.
So there was a sense of acknowledgement that youths are now a legitimate voting bloc. If they could only vote 21 and above back then, now from 18 years old, now fresh out of school, you're allowed to vote. So there's a sense of acknowledgement that, okay, now youths, Malay youths, for our report anyway, are now allowed to be part of the political process. So there's a sense of acknowledgement there. And not just acknowledgement in terms of a democratic process, but also acknowledging them as legitimate citizens, right, who not only have voting rights, but also are acknowledged as part of maybe potential leaders. They are allowed a much earlier start in life to do that now.
Okay.
Resentment, however, comes a lot from the discussions that we had with these youths. So even though there was acknowledgement from a political perspective or democratic perspective, the resentment comes from the fact that, in simple terms, the institutions have not changed with the law. So when we're talking about democratic structures, political structures, a lot of it is still driven and prioritized for those who are older. So I don't know, we can talk about maybe elderly politicians, people who are maybe 40 and above. These are people who are still policymakers, they're still leaders of industry, leaders of, they are the decision makers. So there is a lot of lip service, I think, that came into the election saying that, oh, youths are the future, you're future leaders, your vote is important, we want your voice. But in a lot of the policy making process, in a lot of the decision making process, a lot of youths felt that they were resentful in that sense that, oh, there's a lot of promises for you to be part of the political process, but yet it is very limited in the sense where we want to talk about campaigning, for example, right? We had several youth individuals who we spoke to that talked about how, oh yeah, I mean, generally speaking, yeah, political parties would say we put X number of under 30 or under 35 candidates in certain areas, and that is kind of used as a tagline to say we are youth friendly or we focus on youth. But however, if you examine these areas more closely, you realize, oh, these candidates are put in black zones where they are not expected to win, for example.
Unwinnable seats.
Unwinnable seats, very few resources are given, but that is usually not talked about. So that's an example, that's one of the examples, one of the stories that was given, right? This idea that political acknowledgement of the youths are simply just, well, it's simply just lip service. There's also other areas such as institutions, access to public spaces and community. So there's a lot of resentment that grew out of the fact that even though Undi 18 was built, even though there was a promise by government and democratic systems to acknowledge youths as part of the system did not move beyond that.
Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of the groundwork to allow youth to be part of the system.
Can you elaborate
connected.
what you mean by some of the anxieties or the resentments also having a lack of access to public institutions? What do you mean by that?
So if we go to the northern states and East Coast in particular, there's a lot of question about access to resources. I'll go for the simplest one, which is accessing state resources such as aid or maybe pathways to maybe getting things started. So one of the most salient ones to me that I still remember to this day is the fact that there was a group of Malay youths up in Perlis who wanted to start a mental health movement, and a lot of this was inspired because during the pandemic they saw a lot of their peers going through a lot of mental health difficulties, and they felt that we wanted to kind of bridge that to KKM in their local area and maybe get in touch with local psychologists and whatnot. But when they went to the state government or the local authority, they got stonewalled, or they weren't able to kind of get the sort of resources, or how do you even get started, right? How do we organize a movement? How do we register? Who do I meet to? Who do I need to speak to? And there was a realization in that entire process that the only way I can access institutions and help resources is if I go through a political party. So that would mean that in these areas it would be PAS or UMNO. If the only way I can access these institutions effectively is if I go through the local branch, UMNO branch or PAS branch. And for a lot of these youths, they are apolitical. For them, there's a lot of distrust towards politics and political parties because it is seen as a dirty industry or politicians cannot be trusted. So as much as they could, they do not want to access through that path because then they would feel like they will be used politically as well.
Right, but they see that as the only avenue to access public institutions?
One of the most effective ones. If not, there's a lot of needing to go through paperwork, needing
barriers.
to go barriers. Yeah, need to go to the office over and over again, find the right person, find a person willing to help you with resources. So a lot of the resentment, and I guess inaccessibility of these resources, I think, make them feel like, yeah, I mean, I'm excluded from the system in that sense, right? Unless I have a political backing.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is colloquially we call it cable.
Cable
right?
lah, yeah,
Cable.
yeah, yeah.
If you have
Yeah.
cable, then you can get things
Boleh
done.
adu, yeah.
So the disillusionment, the resentment is based from seeing this system being entrenched. Is
Yeah.
it? Okay.
And I mean, that's just one aspect. But if you're talking also about aid, for example, right? Aid or even public services by local authorities. So if you're talking about aid, a lot of youths are also resentful, I think, in the sense where there's a perception towards them, being Bumi Putra Malay, that we receive a lot of, what's the word? The negative term is tongkat, but you can call it Malay privilege or Bumi Putra privilege, basically, you know, access to institutions and whatnot, kan? Quota system.
I like that. So, I haven't heard that in a long time. Tongkat.
Yeah. I see that used a lot still, but mostly by the slightly older generation.
Like to prop them up. Is it like privilege? Okay.
Yeah. So when we were discussing questions of Malay privilege, Bumi Putra privilege, to be more exact, sorry, they would mention like, I don't benefit in any of the system because when I try to get a loan to start a business, I still have to go through the normal process of a bank. They're not going to give me a loan because my credit score is not great. Or for example, I want to get an education loan through Mara. I either need cable in Mara or it's very difficult for me to be able to get any sort of loan from institutions that are supposed on paper to help me. So in the end, I still have to kind of go through the normal way of PTPTN. I still have to pay off my bank loans. I still need to get a job just like any other person. I can't get a good paying job maybe unless I have cable again, right? So there is this feeling that this extends the idea that there are Bumi Putra policies that are supposed to benefit me is not benefiting me. And then this is idea that a lot of it is because of the excesses of corruption, the excesses of cable. So there is also a resentment against the political class because there is this perception and belief that the system that was supposed to benefit them is being abused and used by the elite, the political elite. So that's why you started seeing, and I think to some extent that's also why PAS has a lot of appeal, because PAS, historically and even till now, are seen as a grassroots party, the party of the people, right? I mean, this is a political party that has its beginnings from basically the ground, right? I mean, if you see how they mobilize, if you see how they do a lot of their engagement work, it is very grassroots.
Right.
It is also, they also frame themselves as kind of anti-elite. If you think about
very egalitarian,
Our Guru Ni Aziz is like the perfect example of a person who lives like a normal person, not in a big bungalow, doesn't drive an expensive car, and people still remember the image of PAS as the party of the people. So that's why this anti-political elite idea, I think, among the youths is quite strong, which is why PAS has another, if it's not Islam, at the very least there's this idea that PAS is a grassroots party that cares about people issues, even if they're not good at governance.
Can I ask you, so I know Malay youth is not monolithic across the country. Were there differences that you noticed or observed by region, by class, in how they responded to some of your questions?
Yeah, I see that a lot when it comes to how they maybe discuss things like race, or how they discuss things like relationship between well, actually, a lot of the differences, I think, will come down to kind of like race-based discussions. So
in different regions?
In different regions. So if I spoke to someone, say, in central regions, so that would be more Klang Valley, Negeri Sembilan-ish area, there's less anxiety or resentment around questions of DAP, for example, or perhaps perceptions of Chinese dominance in certain economic areas. But if I went up to the northern states, especially Kedah, and this is so true for Kedah, and Kelantan in particular, is the question of how they perceive the non-Malay, or to be more specific, to perceive the Chinese community. And they will always point towards Penang as kind of like the example of a non-Malay community that refuses to assimilate, does not want to use the Malay language, and there's a lot of the racial rhetoric that maybe we hear from right-wing groups or maybe conservative Malay nationalists. This is what I hear most coming from these regions, but less so when I talk to individuals coming from the central.
So if I understand correctly, there were regional differences, socioeconomic class differences as well when looking at racial relations, but across the board, disillusionment and resentment towards political elites
is still there.
Is still there?
Is still there, yeah.
I see. When you went into starting this long research and then talking to your respondents, were you expecting this? I mean, a lot of this we suspected, but you've made it concrete with backed by evidence. Were you surprised by the findings of your results? Were there areas or nuances that you were quite you were surprised yourself to learn? Because we have spoken a lot about the economic disillusionment, and I think that cuts across all generations, right? So it's not just young people who feel this way, but a lot of the different generations as well are feeling some kind of the class resentment. But did you find any nuance in your findings that you thought, oh, this is quite surprising specifically for youth?
There were two things that surprised me, which I feel like there's an opportunity there for intervention, right? The first is that despite what I said earlier about more antagonistic views towards non-Malays, I have to also clarify that within the personal life of these individuals, they have very, very positive views of intergroup relationships, friendships. Friendships, to be more exact, not relationships, but friendships. And a lot of this is because a lot of these youths end up going into public university, and they talk a lot about how public university is kind of like the first time, because they grew up in majority Malay communities, is the first time they interacted with a non-Malay, but it was a neutral, positive space where they can engage with each other, they can learn, they can navigate the relationship with respect, without the intervention of political parties or any party that has an agenda. So a lot of them walk out talking about how they had really, really positive views of, they believe, in fact, in the idea that Malaysia is has a multicultural DNA. Of course, there are some caveats to that. Red lines around agama, Islam, some red lines around race, mostly Islam actually. But however, the general view is that, yeah, Malaysia is multicultural. I embrace that. I actually want that. That's who we are as people, right? So that's kind of like the first view, right? And that tells me a lot that there is an opportunity then to create spaces or to activate spaces where maybe there should be more intergroup interactions, right? So, to form social cohesion. Because I think there is, the youth want that. They like that because they feel like, and one of them even use the word, it's exciting. It's exciting having friends from other races, because that's kind of like how life is supposed to be like, right? There are other people, you learn about them, your positive relationship, you learn so much more about the world in that manner. Which then comes to my second point, is when we talk about spaces, or at least the sort of material reality they inhabit, and I think this is not so much surprising to me, but more like it hammers the point home. I think a lot of us, when we talk about any group, I think, for example, any person, for example, I think what we usually lack is kind of like having empathy, or at least trying to understand where they come from, why they form the views that they do. And because our fieldwork, we're all about fieldwork, we're all about going down on the ground, kind of inhabiting. So a lot of it for me was actually being able to go into places like, having the privilege and I think opportunity to go to places like Bandar Perda in Penang, mainland, to go to Perlis, to go to Kelantan, Terengganu, to kind of go into the kampongs, to go into the cities and kind of see for myself and understand, this is why they think the way they do, right? Because they grew up in this context, this environment. That
there is a environmental context to the answers that they've given you, right?
Like, let's say, for example, you go to mainland Penang and you stay there, and I spent like a few days there with some of the youths. I then began to realize, so this is why there's resentment against island side, because you start comparing how not so developed mainland Penang is, Bandar Perda and its surrounding areas, compared to, say, Georgetown or Penang Island, where it's very industrious. And then there's also then the question of like demographic. Majority of non-Malays live in Penang Island. The state government, when it comes down to state planning, a lot of resources are pushed towards towards the island, towards Seberang Perai, where the industries are. So that then clicked to me that no wonder then Perikatan Nasional had a lot of appeal, because they are riding on what they recognize as, I'm experiencing a reality that matches with political anxieties.
So it's very difficult to sit in kind of an ivory tower in Putrajaya and relate
and understand why.
And understand why. I see where you're coming from. Now, I want to ask you why it's important that we pay attention to how Malay youths are feeling. We look around the region, right? We see what's happening in Nepal. We've just seen what's happened in Indonesia. And if we were to not address this, I think there is a risk that it becomes entrenched and becomes something more. So if you, Aziff, were briefing political parties and civil society groups about how to address what you have discovered in your research, what would you advise them to do? What should they stop doing and what should they start doing properly?
Yeah. I think the one thing I haven't mentioned throughout this entire interview, because it's mainstay and everyone's affected by it, is obviously economy.
Of course,
so questions of kind of building up career pathways for a lot of youth so that they don't have to go to gig work, they don't necessarily have to go to entrepreneurship or are forced to go into entrepreneurship. So I think the economy question is a very salient one, and I think government recognizes that. But building an economy is not sufficient, because a lot of youths talk about Najib Razak, they talk about a lot of what One Malaysia kind of offered, which is the idea of a shared national vision. So this is lacking in the current government, right? Economy Madani, Malaysia Madani, what does it mean? A lot of us don't connect with. But One Malaysia, 10, 15 years onwards, even 10 years, so a lot of these kids maybe were in school at that time, but they still remember One Malaysia. So there is this desire, I think, to be able to map Malaysia somewhere in the future. They can't see it.
Okay.
So one other thing that I think government and CSUs can also do is, how do we build a roadmap that genuinely involves the youth as part of national discourse? Under the Barisan government back then, they had this thing called Transformasi Nasional 50.
Yeah.
1050, which was amazing as an idea, because what you had was that it was a bottom-up approach. You got youth to go to discussion events, or what is it called? Stakeholder events where they can like weigh in on issues of security, talk about economy, talk about the future when it comes to Malaysia's place in the global stage. So a lot of TN50, I think, was something that some of the youths that we spoke to talked about a lot. How that felt like genuine decision making.
Oh, they remember.
They remember it very well. I mean, the slightly older ones do, who went through the Barisan era, Barisan National era. So this idea is that the idea also is that you kind of need to provide a space to make youth feel like they are a legitimate part of the democratic system. And that means offering them a voice and also seriously implementing some of these ideas to last beyond elder politicians' lifetimes, right? Because you're talking about planning 20 years ahead, 30 years ahead. These youths will eventually become industrial leaders. Even if they don't become industrial leaders, they will become leaders of their own community, which is equally important. So there is a need, I think, to open up the democratic space as well. And then, of course, there is another question of space as well. We need to build and encourage and activate more shared spaces to allow social cohesion.
I love that, yes.
Yeah. And to me, that is very important. We saw a faint idea of this in Barisan Nationals, again, flawed national surveys, but I think they had an idea of kind of bringing everyone together. There was a flawed methodology to it, but the idea was there. And I think because now the only space where youths can kind of meet together is public universities, but public universities should not hold the burden of being able to do that, because not everyone is able to go to public universities, right? You have people who end up going to private universities, for example, or even go overseas. So maybe there is a need to also think about how do you create community spaces, because that's important. By opening up and activating community spaces where social cohesion can happen, you also allow youths to do events in those areas, can do programs in those areas that create community. With community, you create belonging. And with belonging, you form a sense of meaning. And for these youths, they lack these two things. They lack belonging because there's no spaces for them to be able to have programs, to form community. But because they aren't able to form a sense of belonging to their community, that's why they feel a loss of meaning. So when they feel a loss of meaning, they feel like, who am I in part of this entire fabric of what Malaysia is? Who am I as part of society? Right? Am I just a person who works day to day? Am I just a person who has a loose network of friends? But where am I located in my community? And therefore, where is my community located in the larger, broader picture of Malaysia?
Wonderful. So belonging is something that they should really focus on. Aziff, so this is interesting. What has come out of this research? So this has been an effort to look at Malay youths, but what are you going to focus on next?
So interestingly, when we talk about Malay youths, and I know there's quite a focus on problematizing the Malays, but we realized as we went a year in, we realized actually nobody has actually spoken to non-Malay youths. Nobody has spoken to the Indian community. Nobody has spoken to the Chinese community. What do they think about being part of Malaysia?
Whether their anxieties and aspirations are the same.
Whether it's mapped. And I think that's useful, because if you can find a sort of shared thread between all of us, then we can realize that actually this is a problem that affects everyone, and not just a problem that affects a specific community. The Malay community may be a majority, but everyone is kind of like on the same boat. Malaysia, we're all on the same boat in Malaysia. So one of the projects that we are working on right now is actually exploring very specifically Chinese youths and Indian youth. So we're asking them about questions of belonging. Again, right? How do they feel as Malaysians? How do they feel as part of this national fabric? Questions of economy, questions of what they think about what intra-group problems are. So with the Indian community, we are touching a little bit on questions of caste. How does that affect politics? How does that affect relationships between themselves? With the Chinese community, we're talking about media. What is the place of China? How does China affect their identities and sense of belonging as Malaysians? So there's a very vast, exciting area, I think, that we're looking at, which I'm frankly more excited for than my Malay studies back then. So yeah, very exciting times. And I think leading up to elections, we hope that with all these findings, political parties, CSOs as well, because they're an important part of the ecosystem, will work towards rebuilding back this idea of like a cohesive Malaysia. It doesn't need to be one Malaysia. It just needs to be, we just need to give Malaysians a sense that we can look 5 years ahead, we can look 10 years ahead. And I think that's really, we have a fog right now. A lot of it has to do maybe with geopolitics, the global order, what's going on there right now. But at least within Malaysia, if we can say that in 5 years, this is where we're going to go. In 10 years, we're going to go, and everyone is on the same boat, and I think that will be helpful.
Yeah, if it helps to feel if we're all on the same team.
Yeah.
Aziff, I'm excited for the next research, so keep me posted on that. Hopefully, we'll have you back on to talk about.
I will actually bring my researchers to talk more. I mean, I think they deserve the space to be able to talk about their own communities.
Thank you for sharing the research, this research with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.